like to welcome you to today's multi-stakeholder dialogue, Delivering on the Decade of Action. What can we expect from the world's most influential companies? My name is Casey Brown, and I'm Vice President for Policy at the United Nations Foundation. I'm going to be your moderator today while I suck on this coffee. UNF is proud to be a founding member and current ally of the World Benchmarking Alliance, which you're going to hear more about momentarily. We are honored that this session is being hosted as an official side event at this year's UN High-Level Political Forum, alongside so many critical conversations that are taking place and that are needed to advance our collective understanding and our roadmap of the future and current implications of the global pandemic to sustainability and the vital role that the SDGs play as a framework and approach to response and to building back better. So before we dive in, let's just get the housekeeping items out of the way. One, this event is on the record and it will be recorded. Please feel free to tweet about it and Instagram about it, however you want. You can use hashtag WBA2030, and I think that there are others that we can pop up in the chat box. Two, in adhering to a strong commitment WBA has in building a transparent and inclusive community and environment, this session is intentionally using this Zoom meeting orientation so that everyone can see one another. I think today when we're all connecting on Zoom in various nooks and crannies of our home, hopefully this makes us feel just a little bit closer. And three, we're also using it in the hopes that we can stimulate some good discussion and engagement via the chat box function. So please put your questions in there, put your own examples or solutions and recommendations. And if you want to get started, let us know who's here, where you're from, and what you're hoping to hear from today. So I understand we have a strict cutoff at 9 a.m. this morning, and I want to be able to get to all of the panelists and to allow for a rich discussion. So please bear with us if we move at a pretty fast clip. With that out of the way, and before turning to our first panelist, I just wanted to provide 1 or 2 minutes of context on why this specific conversation is so important today. You know, 6 months ago, we all rolled out of bed, embarking on a new year and a new decade, and with that, an ambitious effort to kickstart that decade of delivery for action toward realizing the SDGs by 2030. We knew then that we had some serious work to do, given the nature of the challenge. A slowing global economy, some stalling poverty rates in places, climate risks being more pressing than ever, inequalities remaining broad within and among countries, including gender equality. And with that, a general recognition that bolder, more transformative approaches to tackling these challenges were needed, and bold partnerships across sectors, including the private sector. And then COVID hit, leading to the health, humanitarian, economic, and development crises of proportions that few of us could have imagined, and frankly, we're not exactly sure what the future holds. Last week, the UN released its annual SDG progress report for 2020, and if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I would suggest that all of you skim through it, because the figures and the data are quite startling indeed. We're going to see poverty rates, extreme poverty rates, rise for the first time in over 2 decades. We're facing a hunger pandemic, basically, proportions we haven't seen in history. Over 90% of children are affected by school closures. Inequalities, gender inequality, and systemic racism are really coming to the fore. And the International Labor Organization warns that 200 million people could end up permanently unemployed. So this is all daunting, but I think the pandemic has also created this new momentum and movement for all actors to be able to step up in response, to work together, to work differently, to ensure recovery opportunities for a more equal, prosperous, and sustainable world are not squandered. And as the UN Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, and many others have noted, the framework for response and recovery already exists in the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. The role of business is clearly a critical and essential part of this work to help transform finance and investment and ecosystems that are needed to bring the world on a trajectory to sustainable development. And that's the challenge and the opportunity that is at our doorstep. What path will we take for the future? And that is the discussion that we want to have today. This session features wonderful speakers across industry and geography expressly to explore how corporate leadership and accountability, and in partnership with others, can incentivize performance, and stimulate action on the SDGs, building momentum for this race to the top for a better world. And in it, we'll be examining the role of the business communities as enablers and catalysts for this decade of action. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Karel van Oosterom, the permanent representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United Nations, who will provide his perspective on the imperative of business working with governments and the powerful role of the SDG framework. So I turn the floor over to you, Ambassador. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Casey. Please call me Carl. You make me feel so old. Good morning to all of you. I'm here in New York. Let me say a few things and let me build on what Casey was just saying. And Casey, let me first pay tribute to the wonderful work the UN Foundation is doing here. I always expressed the hope that one day the UN Foundation will move to Europe as well. And then your place to stay should be in The Hague, which is the other UN capital in the world. So you're more than welcome. And the moment you want to make that move, we'll help you. Casey, you already mentioned the changed context and how completely different the world we are in now compared to 3-4 months ago even. Currently, we have a completely new agenda. On the one hand, we are fighting COVID here at the UN. We're trying to address the humanitarian needs. Finally, last week, the Security Council supported the ceasefire, the call for ceasefire of the Secretary General. Fourth, worldwide, the UN is working on the socio-economic consequences. And 5, and that is what this meeting is very much about, we're focusing on how we can recover better. Recover better, building back better. And what does it mean better? It means better, greener, and fairer. And the good thing is that we have a framework in place for the coming 10 years to make that happen. The SDGs and Agenda 2030 and the private sector and a close alliance between the public sector and the private sector is what is called for. And that's why the work of the World Benchmarking Alliance is so important, because it provides a platform to which companies can measure themselves. For me, it's quite simple. I have a 26-year-old son who 4 years ago got his master's thesis on the theme moving from corporate social responsibility to Agenda 2030, moving from doing no harm to doing the right thing. And in his master's thesis, I think he proved that making that transformational shift from the private sector also makes good business sense. And that's why the work of the World Benchmarking Alliance is so crucial, because it provides benchmarks to which companies on which they can focus. In Holland, we try to help the private sector and to cooperate in responsible business conduct agreements. We don't believe in imposing the will of the government on companies. We try to build a platform. The Kingdom of the Netherlands can only exist because we work together against water. If we do not work together with the citizens, we just simply disappear. And that's the same way we work together with our companies. And the good thing, certainly on the World Benchmarking SDG list, it shows a mirror to all of us, but certainly to the companies. And I hope that this meeting will contribute to, as you phrased it very well, Casey, to a race to the top. No naming and shaming, but learning from each other, and spreading best practices and seeing what a private company can do to perform better and to contribute to a better, greener, and fairer world. Good luck to all of you, and I'm looking forward to this very interesting session. Over to you, Casey.
Thank you so much, Carl. I'll try to be more informal. I think you teed this up exactly perfectly so that we can transition to our next speaker, Paulina Murphy, our engagement director and dear friend at WBA, to elaborate a little bit more on WBA's mission, its ambitious effort, and what is this SDG 2000 report that the ambassador was referring to. Over to you, Paulina.
Thank you, Casey. I think there are some slides that are going to support my words, because there's a lot of information I'm going to depart on all of you right now. So I'll just wait for those to upload. There we go. Great. Thank you. And Excellencies and friends, thank you for joining us today in our virtual event. I think I'm your official host, and I'm just so warm welcome from the World Benchmarking Alliance. As our name suggests, through benchmarking and our global alliance, which is now actually more than 150 organizations, we're really hoping to incentivize companies to align their practices and supply chains to achieve the SDGs. So we need to see robust action from the companies in this decade of action, which Casey referenced at the very beginning. And again, as others have pointed to, perhaps even more so following COVID-19. And we're really pleased to have seen consensus on the role of the private sector in this regard. Only yesterday, Fiona Reynolds at the PRI called the SDGs the world's business plan. And this was during one of our other conversations around transforming capital markets for the SDGs. And so it's with some reassurance that despite the crisis that we're all living through still, the SDGs maintain relevance for companies, and as Fiona said, they are still our roadmap for working forwards. And so we hope that you feel that WBA is doing our part too. Earlier this year, we identified the 2,000 companies globally that we will measure and assess by 2023. This is the SDG 2000 that was referenced, and we have named them as keystone companies for the keystone role that they will play in achieving the SDGs. As you can see, they represent 43 trillion in revenue and are headquartered across 74 countries. They all have dominance and have an influence dialogue with different stakeholders. They all have a presence, whether it's through their operations or supply chains in developing countries. So we know that these companies are influential as we report impact in alignment to the SDGs. So the SDG 2000 is truly a global footprint, and this is why we bring you all here today to this conversation. As I said, we'll assess the 2,000 companies by 2023, and we're going ahead with it through a system transformation approach. We consulted on how we should go about the measurement, but the systems approach we feel really recognizes the complexity and the interconnectedness of the goals. And so, as you can see in front of you, we see the systems as 3 concentric circles. At the center is our social transformation, and this takes into account everything from gender inequality to racial inequality, human rights, and more. And I'll talk you through a little bit more on that later. The second layer of the circle focuses on the other thematic transformations. And in these, we are at different stages of development. And as you can see, that's digital, food and agriculture, decarbonisation and energy, circular and urban. So in terms of the speed at which we're going, you may have seen last week that we released a benchmark on the electric utilities industry, which sits in our energy and decarbonisation system. And we also launched a framework for the food and agriculture system transformation. So one is the launch of the actual data and the ranking of the companies, and the other is the framework for how we will in the future measure business performance in food and ag. And then the third layer of the circle looks at the financial system, and you all know this has a dual role to play. So firstly, we believe that the financial system can only play its role if it transforms itself and becomes more long-term and aligned with the SDGs, and moves from looking at sustainability from a risk mitigation lens and much more towards impact. And so for this reason, we've identified 400 financial services companies that we will also measure as part of our commitment. And the second role, which we're all familiar with, of course, as with the financial system, is in how it mobilizes the capital needed to enable the other 6 transformations. And I promised to come back to the red dot in the middle. At the core, we have our social inclusion system, and we are working on applying baseline core social topics to assess all the SDG 2000 companies on their commitments to human rights, equality, and empowerment for the social transformation, systems transformation. That's a bit of a mouthful to say, but here you can see the 15 pillars that we have included in our scoping reports and our draft methodology. The methodology is currently open for consultation, and we would really welcome feedback from you on these 15 pillars. And so the first, for those who know the world of human rights, you will recognize, for example, that the first 5 are aligned to the UN GPs, and then we're looking at the ILO standards as well. And so to demonstrate wherever possible, we've looked at existing standards and frameworks that are already that companies are already working with and are familiar with, so we don't reinvent the wheel and avoid duplication. And this is the reason that we have a multi-stakeholder alliance, so that we can really work in partnership with those organizations who are already involved in the transformation work. We'll add a registration link to the consultations on our social system in the chat box, so you have an opportunity to let us know that you're interested in stepping in. And so our challenge for the discussion today is that we hope to continue far beyond the high-level political forum. How do we create a decade of disclosure and a transparency revolution, so that we can really understand what companies are doing, how they're using their influence, whether it's positive and negative, and move towards those companies acting in a way that is positively contributing to the SDG agenda. The good news, I think, for all of us is that there is a common theme emerging from this year, is the critical need to shift to a long-term view, to truly stakeholder-oriented capitalism, and fundamentally reconceptualizing how investors see risk. And we also need to see through our work how COVID-19 pandemic has impacted vulnerable communities and is exacerbating existing inequalities. So we really hope that through our SDG 2000 measurement, this will play a key role in ensuring that the way that companies behave is working towards the positive contribution, as I said. I don't want to take up any longer with my remarks. We hope to leave some Q&A to the end. And but just to conclude for now, that we would like for all of us to work together to ensure that this is the beginning of the dialogue on this business impact and on business measurement, and we hope to gather contributions from working with all of you. Thank you. Back to you, Casey.
Thank you so much, Paulina. That was really inspiring and very clearly stated. I do think we actually have a few minutes, so maybe Carl and Paulina, we could throw a question or two at you. I'm also going to continue to try to get the online discussion going. So let me throw one question out to the virtual participants, and then to Ambassador and to Paulina. So I think, there's a question about how can governments work with and engage the private sector to ensure that SDGs are at the core of responding to these critical economic needs, including in the context of where we are today with the global pandemic. So what are some approaches, recommendations, and solutions that are needed? I'll give that to you too, both of you. And also, if I can sneak one more in that is related to the SDG 2000. For both of you, I think, what do you see today as the greatest opportunity and risk in helping to really translate the SDG 2000 strategy into action, maximizing, the opportunity that we have to really shake things up and work in a more business unusual way? Over to either of you.
I feel like I should offer Carol the opportunity to go first.
On this one, I've been educated by my son, who did an analysis in his thesis of 6 companies in Holland, Unilever, Philips, and 4 more, where he basically looked at the strategy of the company and looked at the way the key question whether the business strategy of the company involved was aligned with the SDGs. So very simply, Unilever is a very good example, like DSM and 2 or 3 other Dutch companies who took the lead when it came to aligning its business strategy with the SDGs. But just simply looking, what are we doing, why are we doing it, and how does it fit into the SDGs? And at Unilever, it was quite clear that some of their business elements were extremely irrelevant and others were highly relevant. And by doing that exercise and even moving the whole corporate sustainable responsibility and the 2030 agenda out from the public affairs office of the organization, but streamlining it to the main strategic, how can I say this, the strategy of the office. Even that institutional change contributed a lot. It needs a mind change, and I see too often that many companies, the SDGs are a public relations thing, whereas if you look at the total market which is developing and which is trillions and trillions, if you align in the right way, I'm convinced that doing the right thing also means being profitable.
I completely agree, and to maybe to illustrate that through a case study, we published our Sustainable Seafood Index last October, and there are many Japanese companies on that ranking, and we had a dialogue with one of the companies last week, and they noted to us that subsequently to being ranked fairly low on that index, the sustainability team within the company took the matter to the management or the senior leadership team and asked that something is taken, so actions are taken on the back of the benchmark and essentially the gap analysis that the benchmark provides for that company on what actions the company needs to take. And I'm pleased to say that we learned last week that the leadership team of this company had then called the other subsidiary leaders to a meeting to discuss the results and to identify the gaps and where they need to make further progress. So it's the benchmarking, when it's transparent and there's an accountability attached to that data, does help in our experience, help improve companies take those commitments to actions, and so where we have evidence then to support that, that's the then the value of working through the alliance and for stakeholders supporting companies in identifying the steps that they can take. On the question around governments and companies, there's always the companies who are willing to act as leaders in any given system, and there are always those companies who are who have curiosity about things that they can do but they need help. But then there is always the companies who actually they don't want to engage with the agenda, they don't feel that they have an opportunity to lead, and they rely on government intervention in the shape of new policy norms or legislation to help them, or to just move the whole industry forward. And this is where we can identify those practices that are not making voluntary progress on their own, where we need we're having a policy dialogue with governments on those issues that need a bit of extra support. And there was a question I saw in chat about whether companies on our SDG 2000 list step in voluntarily. No. So when we launched the 2000 companies, we identified those that are most impactful on the SDG agenda, whether it's positive, whether it's negative, and so we have a methodology that identified those companies, and it's not voluntary.
Thanks, Paulina. And if I may, I think we have 1 or 2 more minutes before we're going to move on to the next segment. And it's fantastic to start to see the chat box rolling. There are several questions that are really around kind of the methodology for the strategy, including, how does the WBA work intersect and leverage some existing reporting efforts? And what are some of the next steps that can be expected also in terms of making sure that there's as much engagement as possible? So that kind of a communications effort as well. So just feel free if you have any thoughts there, and we'll be sharing as much information as possible too.
So I know my colleagues will add to what I don't have time to cover now. But through our alliance, it's really important to us that we draw on existing efforts and that we don't duplicate. So if you have a look on our website, you'll see that we work with the CDP, GRI, SASB, Global Compact, many more, in looking at what standards already exist in terms of companies reporting on sustainability issues. Sometimes many of these organizations have existed before the SDGs came into being, and so the WBA is then looking at where the gaps are so that we can be aligned at looking at impact of those companies aligned to the SDGs. But for in our climate and energy and decarbonisation system, the CDP is our research partner. So we work together very closely, almost on a day-to-day basis, in identifying exactly the measurement areas that we should be asking of companies, and then also to avoid a burden of reporting for companies. Where we can, we align our efforts with the existing frameworks and standard setters. And on engagement and next steps, we have ambition to establish collective engagements through the alliance. So in some cases they might be investor-led, but in other cases our unique role is to be able to do multi-stakeholder collective engagement. We'd love to do more of that next year as we start to come out with more and more actually data on which stakeholders can take forward and then engage with the companies that we have measured. And so if you do have ambition to help us with that effort, please get in touch, and you'll see us increasing that as towards the end of this year and early next.
Great, fantastic. You know what? I said we were going to move along at a fast clip, and I think that so far we're right on time. So that's a challenge to us for the next round of speakers. If that's okay, we'll transition. I think that I want to thank Carl and Paulina both for laying out the case and why the SDGs and actually why the shift in conversation around the SDGs, not just as a nice to have, but as a must have, and what role for the business community and the work that WBA is really doing to try to accelerate action and ambition is really fantastic. So we're going to move to the next segment of discussion, which is going to provide some perspectives from civil society, business, and government leaders themselves. So let me turn to our next speaker, Dr. Anita Patil-Deshmukh. I'm pleased to invite you. You are the Executive Director of PUCAR to take our Zoom floor. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with what PUCAR is, it's based in Mumbai, India. And you please do correct me if I'm stating this incorrectly, but I believe that it aims to democratize research among disenfranchised youth and communities to then use that research as a tool to empower themselves to create knowledge that contribute towards making their communities more inclusive and more sustainable. You are also a member of the WBA Digital Inclusion Benchmark Executive Review Committee, and I'm just really excited to hear what you have to say this morning. So I guess to tee it off, Anita, can you discuss a little bit how PUCAR has encountered the issue of business accountability on the SDGs in its work, and what role you see for this business civil society partnership today? Thank you so much. Just come off, if you can come off mute really quickly.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Okay, sorry. So it's indeed an honor for me to be on this panel, and please, it's such a privilege for me to be able to share the stories of how internet companies actually can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to tell you some stories which actually have come from PUCAR's project on digital divide that is supported by Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiative. So let me begin with the story of Noshi. Noshi is a tribal woman, a 30-plus-year-old who works in a small village located about 140 kilometers north of Mumbai, the financial capital of India. Being this close to the financial capital, you would expect that we will have a great internet coverage in the region, right? Far from the truth. Noshi wanted to put away in a safe place 500 rupees she had saved with great difficulty, hiding it away from her alcoholic husband. Since physical banking infrastructure is not widespread in tribal regions of India, a private bank created a mini bank that can do cash withdrawals and cash deposits through an assigned agent. It's a handheld little instrument. This particular software is connected to the main branch through the internet. Noshi approached the mini bank agent and gave her her precious 500 rupees to keep it in her account. The agent took the 500 rupees, but her passbook could not be updated at that point in time because internet was not available. After a few days, Noshi went back to the agent because she wanted to withdraw some money from what she had deposited. Guess what, guys? The agent said, "Sorry, you never gave me any money." He completely denied it. And since she did not have evidence in terms of a passbook update, she really lost her precious 500 rupees. Now, you would want to know why the internet was not available. Because the internet tower put up by the provider runs on electricity. Energy supply is neither constant nor predictable. To make the matters worse, the backup generator, which runs on one of the most polluting fuel in the world, the diesel, it runs only for 2 hours. So after 2 hours, the internet went out. This kind of stories of exploitation are extremely common in the rural sectors of India. The other problem also is inclusivity. Almost all these transactions that happen through banking systems are in English. Now, how do you expect tribal and marginal people in rural India to learn English? So this particular story tells us the failure on the providers to contribute fully to SDGs number 5, number 7, and number 10. Number 5 for gender equity, number 7 for providing clean energy, and number 10 for reducing inequality. Another small story. Ganesh is another tribal person who lives in a village which is approximately 8 kilometers from a small place where there is an ATM. One evening, Ganesh needed cash on an emergency basis because he had to take his mother to the hospital. Ganesh literally ran 8 kilometers to get to the ATM, only to find out the ATM was not working because the server was down. The server had been down for 2 days and it had not been fixed. This clearly shows a total lack of accountability. Servers go down frequently and they are really not fixed, at least in the rural sectors in India, very easily. Of course, Ganesh had no other option but to get the needed cash from the moneylender from the village, who charged him 120% interest rate. Such incidences are extremely common in rural sectors in India, and this is all due to unavailability of internet services. Health calamities and related expenses often push people into poverty, which is well known worldwide. This relates closely to SDG number 1, which aims to eliminate the poverty across the globe. Almost all welfare schemes which are created by Government of India are actually available on the internet, but accessing the internet, availability of it, poor speed causes people not to be able to access these schemes. This again works into SDG number 1 and number 10. SDG number 1 is about getting rid of poverty across the globe, and 10 is about inequality. I would like to bring to your kind attention that equality has been mentioned in SDGs 4, 5, and 10, yet the digital divide remains very high everywhere. As per the latest UN data, which was released literally on July 11th, out of 100 people, 56 people do not have access to internet. Looking back, provision of internet for all should have been one of the SDGs, don't you think? In view of the current pandemic, not including this particular agenda in the SDGs seems like a huge gap. I would like to strongly suggest that internet provider companies take care of all these issues and contribute to the achievement of SDGs. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think rooting the stories that you're laying out provides a reality check. Sometimes we can all get caught up in saying leave no one behind, but really understanding what that really means, what the barriers are and what the needs are is so important to be able to drive and accelerate these conversations forward. Thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Let's move it along if we can, and hopefully we'll have time to have a robust Q&A at the end, including with Dr. Anita. So let's turn to the business case for the SDGs. I think on the flip side of the coin that we were just hearing from, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Shankar Venkateshwaran, the operating partner and head of ESG investment with eCube Investment Advisors. My understanding is that it is a WBA ally. If I get this right, eCube stands for Engage and Empower for SDG, for the ESG. So if you could tee up for us, can you discuss why and how the investor community should prioritize the SDGs and ESG in its work and this role in building back better? The Zoom floor is over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Casey, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to my co-panelists and participants. It's a great privilege and honor to be part of this discussion. Let me begin by briefly introducing eCube. You did that, Casey, but a little bit more detail that we are a relatively new financial institution set up by veterans from the investment, business, and ESG spaces in India. And our purpose is to embed sustainability or ESG into Indian business. To begin with, we would do that by enabling companies to invest in technologies and equipment that further ESG, that deepen ESG, that address climate issues. So SDGs is therefore very, very core to who we are. It almost defines our own success as we go along. And we are, as you said, proud to be a member of WBA. Coming to the way investors look at this, I think it's important to recognize that investors, along with customers and regulators, are stakeholders that companies take very, very seriously and listen to very, very seriously. So we recognize that, therefore, investors can play a significant role in the SDG agenda. In fact, we at eCube believe that investors have a responsibility to work with the companies they fund, they invest in on getting on the SDG journey. Now, just to sort of understand how investors work and think, one of the things that investors are very sensitive to is risks. You obviously want to make investments or make lending, but you want to make sure you get the money back so that you can continue doing that. And what is, I think, becoming very, very apparent to most investors is that looking at the traditional success factors for businesses no longer enough. And sustainability or ESG are very, very critical to ensure that investments are free from risk. And because of this understanding, investors are also more and more willing to use their clout with the investee companies to ensure that they prioritize ESG more and more in the way they operate, the way they run their businesses. A classic example is investors after the Paris Agreement who decided they're going to withdraw from all coal-based investments. And that actually sent a very important message to, say, fossil fuel companies to sort of think renewables in a far more systematic way than they were doing. And of course, what COVID-19 has done is to increase the sensitivity to these risks and emphasize the need to build resilience and also demonstrate this resilience. So risk is very central to how investors look at this. And what the SDGs do is provide that framework, provide a template by which one can look at, investors can look at and understand these risks. So SDGs, therefore, is a very important part of it. But there's also the flip side. I think investors also understand that you need to look for opportunities because at the end of the day, it's about growing investments and growing those opportunities. And I think what is become increasingly clear is that sustainability, ESG, provide those opportunities. For example, renewable energy, electric vehicles, green infrastructure, alternative materials, thinking about the circular economy. All of these are things that are business opportunities that is emerging from the kind of crises that we have, both environmental and social. And again, SDGs provide an interesting template by which we can understand this. So investors therefore look to SDGs to say, how can we then look for companies that can create businesses at the same time find solutions or solve for SDGs? So it's very central to the way we look at things. But having said that, there are certain challenges for companies to engage on SDGs, and therefore for investors to engage with companies on SDGs. And I'll just state a few of them. For one, SDGs is very often seen as a cost and not as an investment. And therefore, people see it as something not directly core to business. And part of the reason for why this happens is that the business case for sustainability, for looking at SDGs is still not fully established. Some companies get it, they understand it, but still a large number of companies don't understand that it is about the way you run your business. Third, of course, is the fact that you have 17 SDGs, 169 targets, and that kind of, by the time people start going through the list, they're kind of tired. So that's overwhelming for many companies. And I think what is also important to recognize that markets are still slow to reward companies that actually demonstrate performance along SDGs. So it's not that you talk to a company and they say, yeah, we're gung-ho about it. It takes some work. But fortunately, there are opportunities. And that's, I think, the good news about how SDGs are evolving. There are far more number of tools that help companies to align themselves. And I think what the work that WBA does is so critical in helping companies understand SDGs and aligning themselves more and more with SDGs. And also, increasingly, companies are responding to and reporting on SDGs. Again, institutions like the WBA, institutions like GRI, Global Compact, all these are providing tools for reporting, so understanding and reporting on it. I think that institutions like us, and we're not alone. I'm hoping that we're just a beginning of many more that are specialized in sort of providing finance to companies on SDGs or on climate. The more of such companies exist, the more there is money that is available for companies to make these investments. And as the business case gets understood and established, and there's more funds flowing into this, the chances are that you will have more and more companies doing that. And there is evidence that we can see. A couple of things from an Indian context that I thought I would just key in very quickly. The government of India has something called the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct that's aligned with the SDGs as well as with the UNGPs. So that alignment is also helping companies in India, for example, understand this better. And some changes in the Companies Act to get more boards to engage themselves with these kinds of issues will also help this process. So the picture looks mixed, but the trend is very clear. Investors are convinced. Companies are just a matter of time before more and more companies take this up. So that's where I look at this. Happy to talk about it more as we have more time. Thank you.
Chakra, thank you so much. What a tour de force over the last 5 minutes, providing your assessment of why the business case is so needed. I just want to point out that in 2015, the Business and Sustainable Development Commission really tried to do exactly that, which was to say, let's move this away from what are the costs of incorporating the SDGs to what are the opportunities. I wonder if today there might be an opportunity as we're hearing about all of the risks and challenges and backsliding. What are the costs going ahead in continuing to incorporate the SDGs squarely into business plans and partnerships there may be an opportunity for a joint project. Let me now turn the floor over to our final speaker. I am delighted to introduce Ambassador Neil Pierre, the permanent representative to the mission of Guyana and the interim chair of the G77, who's going to be speaking in his national capacity today. Ambassador, I understand that Guyana underwent its voluntary national review on its SDGs recently and has also been an active contributor on the financing for development issue, among other areas connected to the SDGs. Could you provide your thoughts on what is needed to maintain momentum for the SDGs, including the role of transparency and accountability? And as we've heard from Paulina, I think, who called it the decade of disclosure from the private sector. Why does it matter? And what do we need to do going forward? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Casey. I thank the organizers for inviting me to speak in my national capacity. And I also thank the preceding panelists, presenters who spoke eloquently on specific examples in their own experiences. I want to start by giving a little picture for those who are not aware of what Guyana's makeup is, or development trajectory, etc. So let me say, first of all, that Guyana is a small country with a population of just about $750,000, a small town or city in many countries that are sitting around the table right now. The land mass is about 214,970 square kilometers. Fairly large in land size, small in population, but the bulk of that population, 90%, I would say, of the population lives only on 10% of the land, the coastal strip. Guyana was placed in the upper middle income developing country category starting from 2016. And right now we're dealing with a projected GDP growth rate annualized of 52.8%. And that's projected for 2020 and beyond. And we'll come to the reasons for that in a bit. But this middle income status defies the reality of poverty, which is currently measured at roughly 36.1% of the population living below the poverty line, and gross inequalities. There are gender disparities, and along with that, of course, high rates of gender-based violence and discrimination, challenges in health, education, and social cohesion. More can be said about those factors as well. And to crown all of this off, there is an endemic weak institutional and human resource capacity, partly due to the massive brain drain. Institutions exist, but are very poorly resourced and equipped to do the work they're supposed to do. A turning point in the country's development trajectory actually happened a few years ago with the massive discovery of oil production, oil resources rather, and then of course the drilling and exploitation of those resources, largely by a conglomerate headed by ExxonMobil. The oil production formally began at the end of 2019. There has been a slight slowing down because of the COVID-19, but drilling has restarted just about a month ago. But what it means is, of course, a lot of this production that is off the exclusive economic zone on the Atlantic coast of the country has catapulted the country into a new level of transformation, economic, social, and even political transformation almost overnight. And this has a lot of the attendant difficulties of the resource curse that we know about so well. As I said earlier on, GDP growth is projected at 52.8% for 2020. And by 2024, the IMF projects that oil export will account for about at least 40% of the GDP of the country in just about 4 years or so, from a position of 0% of oil and energy production being part of the economic mix of the country to a level of 40% in 4 years. The current government, and that government has been in place since 2015, There are currently a lot of issues to be settled, governance issues to be settled in the country, and the courts are very active these days in the attempts to resolve those electoral issues. But the current government articulated a Green Development Strategy 2040 with the aim of making the country fully compliant with sustainable development principles. And I think there are about 8 areas or sectors identified to activate this Green Development Strategy. There is an official acknowledgement that the 2030 Agenda, and this is part of the Green Development Strategy approach, the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda provide the basis for the National Development Strategy and objectives. There is also fairly widespread recognition that while government is in the lead in terms of embedding the sustainable development principles and objectives in the country's development approach, strong partnership is necessary to achieve sustainable development objectives. But when you put that against the weak social cohesion that underpins this, the country's makeup, and also, of course, the weak institutional and technical capacity, achieving this partnership becomes even more necessary and even more of a challenge. Let me just speak very quickly about some of the steps that have been made towards engaging the private sector in Guyana's case.
That's great. And sorry, Ambassador, that sounds fantastic. And we have about 7 minutes. I'm supposed to be the strict taskmaster here because we're going to get bumped off.
I'm so sorry.
No,
Let me get straight to the point then and say that the VNR 2019, and to answer your question specifically, the government did take a multi-sector approach to putting together the Voluntary National Review report. There's an active private sector involvement. I think the large problem, of course, is that the private sector does not embrace or see itself as part of a 2030 SDG agenda. And so there's that awareness and engagement effort that really needs to be prioritized at the national level and beyond. I will stop there, and anything else can be asked via questions.
Thank you so much. And I apologize again. I wish that we could extend this, double the amount of time. I think that your point that you just stated at the end about the role of the private sector and the multi-stakeholder engagement, including through reporting mechanisms like the Voluntary National Review, is really a critical one to think about and think about more intentionally as we move forward. So, I think we have, again, just a few minutes. What I've heard today is really, we don't have an easy task ahead, but I think that we have a commitment to put, lockstep, arm in arm to try to advance this conversation and the actions that are needed to bring sustainability principles and goals, as Ambassador Carl said, more into core business models and practices. This isn't just a public relations thing, to incorporate integrated approaches to inequalities, to climate and poverty and development, including the role of internet and internet access, I would say, and to establish or partner around creative and scalable financing, investment, and accountability issues. If I might we can do maybe a really quick, 20-second round robin for the speakers, whoever wants to come in. I had one question to end, and then Paulina, maybe you could be our final speaker and provide some closing remarks. Going back to the title of this discussion, what would you say, speakers, is the single most important thing that you would recommend, just really quickly, we can or must expect from companies as we move ahead into this decade of action and in this new crisis, to effectively engage, bring companies into this discussion, and to hold companies accountable for their performance in achieving the SDGs? I open the floor, and again, this is like a real quick, little reaction here. And maybe, Carl, if you would like to start.
20 seconds to the private sector. Show that companies also have a conscience, but also know where the real profits are, and contribute to making the world greener, fairer, and better.
Fantastic. Anita, do you want to come in?
In addition to talking to the investors and stakeholders, there has to be inclusion of community, and community capitalism has to be practiced by all companies.
Community capitalism. Perfect. Shankar.
Apart from what Karan and Anita said, I think a lot more transparency, a lot more disclosures by companies on some of these issues, because I think disclosures not only help our external stakeholders understand what the company is doing, but the company, it also puts a mirror to the company to figure out that how it needs to get better at what it's doing. So disclosures and more disclosures is what I would say.
Fantastic. And I think was it Paulina who said let's ignite the decade of disclosure? Ambassador.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the transformation needed in the governance structures and the policy frameworks, corporate policy frameworks, to give effect to what they're committing to in the SDG agenda.
Wow, I applaud all of you. That was very succinct, very powerful. So I really want to thank you all for coming out today, to hearing from these diverse perspectives, and to learning more about and becoming more invested in the work of the WBA and our collective work to help to advance corporate engagement toward the SDGs. Paulina, I can give you the floor for final closing remarks.
Thank you, Casey, and kudos to you. You've kept us to time. That's incredible. Thank you. So I'd like to finish, like other panelists, I'd like to finish with a call to action. But as we're multi-stakeholder, I'll have other calls to action to other actors. So let's start with civil society. Please use our benchmarks and the SDG 2000 to advance accountability in this decade of action. Our benchmarks are free and publicly available, so you can see everything that we do. The methodologies are open. And this will help ensure that we focus on the leaving no one behind agenda and protecting the most vulnerable. But we need your help. We need you to do the translation to get these benchmarks in use with your communities and your networks. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also join us as we move to build collective engagements towards the end of this year. To governments, I would say, please help us with setting standards and norms that can catalyze the true decade of disclosure that I talked about and the transparency revolution. We need consistent reporting from the private sector, and that stakeholder expectations are put into these standards of how companies behave. And then also to the private sector, please embrace our benchmarks and use them, learn from them, so that you go forwards in a rights-based approach to building back better. And finally, to everyone on this call, thank you again for your collaboration. And I hope that you agree with me that we need to work with both accountability on the one hand and leadership on the other to achieve the impact that we all want to see. So thank you to everybody on this panel, to Casey for chairing, and have a good evening, good day, wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.